Everyone feared the giant widow in the cage, until the rancher bought her and asked, "Marry me." The cage stood at the edge of the dusty fairgrounds, looming like a scar against the horizon. Inside it sat a woman larger than any man in the crowd, her wrists bound in heavy iron cuffs, her eyes cold as if carved from stone. The townsfolk called her the giant widow. They whispered of her husband's mysterious death, of her strength that could break bones with a careless grip, of the lawmen too afraid to keep her in a cell. Children clung to their mother's skirts when passing her cage, while men spat and muttered curses from a safe distance. She never spoke. She sat in silence, her broad shoulders straight, her jaw firm, her gaze fixed beyond the people who mocked and feared her. The cage was both her prison and her shield, though no one in town dared to admit they were as much imprisoned by her presence as she was by the bars. The rancher arrived on a quiet morning, dust rising with each step of his boots. He was not a man who wasted words. Broad-chested, weather-worn, his eyes carried the kind of steadiness forged from years of solitude on open land. Unlike the others, he did not mock, nor shrink back. He studied her as though she were not a monster but a riddle. "Is she for sale?" His voice cut through the murmurs. The showman, a greasy fellow who profited off her misery, grinned with yellow teeth. "She ain't a horse, mister. She's a danger, a curse. Folks say she snapped her man in two." The rancher's gaze didn't waver. He slid a hand into his coat and laid down a pouch heavy with coin. The clinking sound silenced the crowd. "Name your price." The showman hesitated, but greed overtook fear. The deal was struck, the key exchanged. The rancher stepped forward, and in front of the whole town, unlocked the cage. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The woman did not move, only lifted her head to meet his eyes. "You're free," he said. Her voice was low, raw from years unused. "Free to go where?" He did not flinch at her size, nor her tone. "Come with me. Be my wife." The crowd erupted in disbelief. Men laughed nervously, women crossed themselves, children hid behind skirts. But the rancher stood firm, as though his words were not madness but destiny. She rose to her full height, towering above him. Her chains clattered as she stepped out of the cage for the first time in years. The ground trembled beneath her boots, and the people shrank back, holding their breath. She looked at the man who had bought her, searching for mockery in his eyes, for the fear that lived in everyone else's. She found none, only a steady resolve, as though he had seen through the rumors and found a truth the world had overlooked. "Why?" she asked, her voice heavy with suspicion. "Because strength deserves a place it can belong," he answered. "And because I'm tired of being alone." Her heart, long hardened by loss and betrayal, flickered at the honesty in his tone. No man had ever looked at her without cruelty or fear since the day her husband died. No one had spoken to her as though she were more than a spectacle. She searched him for weakness, for lies, but found only a quiet courage that mirrored the silence she had lived in for too long. The crowd watched as she placed her massive hand into his. His fingers were small against hers, yet they clasped with equal weight. Together they walked away, leaving the cage behind, leaving the whispers trembling in the dust. At his ranch, the land stretched wide and wild, the kind of place where the world could not reach. Days bled into nights, and she began to work beside him, hauling lumber, mending fences, tending to cattle. Her strength, once a curse, became the very thing that built a home. She moved with purpose, with a quiet discipline that made the ranch thrive in ways it never had. At first, the town gossiped, waiting for disaster, certain she would crush him in his sleep, certain he would regret binding his life to hers. But weeks passed, then months, and their ranch became a place of strange wonder. The widow who had once been a spectacle in a cage now worked the earth with her bare hands, while the rancher, once a loner, walked at her side with a calm steadiness that no storm could shake. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in fire, she stood with him at the edge of the corral. The cattle were quiet, the air heavy with the scent of dust and grass. She broke her silence. "You're not afraid of me." He looked at her, his face lined by years but softened in her presence. "No, fear is for those who don't see truth. I see you." Her throat tightened, the weight of his words pressing into the cracks of her guarded soul. For years she had been a monster in the eyes of others, a prisoner, a spectacle. But in his eyes, she was neither curse nor danger. She was simply a woman, wounded yet unbroken, strong yet yearning for the simplest of things: belonging, trust, love. The cage she had carried in her heart began to break, piece by piece, under the weight of his quiet devotion. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe not as the giant widow, but as a woman stepping into the light of a life she thought forever lost. And in the stillness of that night, when the wind carried the scent of rain and the earth sighed beneath their feet, she whispered the words that sealed the bond between them. The cage was a thing of iron and shame. It sat at the far end of the fairgrounds where the dust never settled, where the wind always whistled through its bars like a hymn for the condemned. Inside it, she sat, massive, immovable, shoulders too broad for the blouse that hung on her frame, wrists clasped in manacles blackened with rust. To the townsfolk she was not a woman, not even a person. She was a warning, a spectacle. The children called her the giant widow. The men muttered other names, uglier ones, and spat into the dirt whenever they passed her cage. The women clutched their little ones closer, whispering of the poor husband she had killed, snapped him like a dry branch, they said, then let the law drag her off. Yet no law would hold her long. They built no prison for her, no court to try her, only this cage where she could be pointed at, laughed at, feared. Her face was stern, chiseled, her jaw set as though carved from stone. But her eyes were deep wells that drank in everything without spilling a single drop. She never answered the taunts, never bent beneath the insults, never lowered her gaze. She was silence, and that silence frightened them more than any threat. Then, on a day when the sun blazed without mercy, when even the crows had retreated from the heat, a man came walking down the main street of town. His hat brim cut a shadow across his weathered face, his boots left sharp prints in the dust, and his stride was the kind that carried no hesitation. He was a rancher, though not many knew him well. He lived far out on land so wide the sky seemed to belong only to him. He was known for few words, fewer friends, and a life of quiet grit. He stopped before the cage. The crowd gathered quick, drawn by curiosity like flies to honey. The showman, slick with sweat and greed, stepped forward, ready to pitch his tale. He thrived on this, turning human misery into coin. "Step right up, stranger. Ain't never seen the likes of her, have ya? Strong as a bull, heart black as pitch. She's a killer, they say." Snapped her husband clean in two. The rancher's eyes, a gray that caught every flicker of light, stayed fixed on the woman in the cage. He saw the size of her hands, the lines carved into her skin, the stillness that radiated more power than the shouts of the crowd. He did not look away when her gaze rose to meet his. "Is she for sale?" he asked. The murmurs in the crowd turned sharp, disbelieving. The showman blinked, caught off guard. "Sale, mister. She ain't a horse. She's a spectacle, a curse in human form. Folk pay good money just to gawk at her. I wouldn't." The rancher reached into his coat and laid a pouch heavy with coins on the table beside the cage. The clink of silver rang louder than the crowd's whispers. "Name your price," he said. The showman's greed battled with fear. His lips curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "All right, if you're fool enough to take her, she's yours." The key was handed over, the deal struck. Silence swept through the crowd like a wave. The rancher stepped forward, slid the key into the lock, and pulled the cage door open. Gasps broke out. Children pressed their faces against their mothers' skirts. Men stepped back, hands brushing over the handles of their pistols. The woman inside did not move at first. She only lifted her head, studying him as though he were some new riddle she'd been handed after years of the same ones. "You're free," the rancher said. Her voice, when it came, was low and rough, as though unused for years. "Free to go where?" His eyes didn't leave hers. "Come with me. Be my wife." The words struck like a hammer. The crowd erupted. Some laughed, some cursed, others muttered about madness and witchcraft. But he did not flinch. He stood there, quiet, calm, as if he'd asked her nothing more unusual than to share a meal. The giant widow rose. Her full height dwarfed him, casting a long shadow in the blazing sun. The manacles clattered as she stepped forward, chains dragging across the earth. The people recoiled, sure she would tear him apart then and there. But instead, she stopped in front of him, towering above, her breath steady, her eyes searching. "Why?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. "Because strength deserves a place it can belong. And I'm tired of being alone." Something flickered in her chest, faint as a coal buried beneath ash. For years she had been nothing but a beast in their eyes, a monster in a cage. No man had looked at her with anything but fear or mockery. But here stood a man who offered her not freedom in the hollow sense, not pity, but a place, a life. Slowly, she lifted her bound hands. He reached up and unlatched the iron cuffs. They fell to the ground with a final clang. And with that sound, something shifted in the air. She placed her massive hand into his. His was small against hers, yet steady, unyielding. Together they walked out of the fairgrounds, the cage behind them, the murmurs chasing them like ghosts. The journey to his ranch was long, stretching across endless land where grass bent beneath the wind and the sky arched wide and merciless above. She rode beside him in silence, unused to freedom, unused to companionship. He did not press her with questions. He simply rode, his presence a quiet anchor. When they reached his land, she saw a place rough yet alive. Fences needed mending, cattle lowed in the distance, the house stood worn but solid against the horizon. It was no palace, no fortress, but it was real, and it was his. Work became their language. She hauled lumber with ease, drove posts deep into the ground, carried water barrels that would have taken 2 men to move. The ranch thrived under her hands, and he worked beside her without complaint, without awe, as though her strength were as natural as the wind itself. At night, they sat in silence by the fire. At first, the quiet was heavy, filled with the echo of years she had spent in chains and years he had spent in solitude. But slowly, something else grew in that silence, a peace, fragile yet undeniable. The town waited for disaster. They whispered that she would crush him in his sleep, that she would burn his ranch to the ground, that no man could bind himself to a creature like her without ruin. But the weeks passed, and then months, and nothing came of their predictions. Instead, the ranch grew strong, the land fertile under their shared labor. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, she stood with him at the corral, watching the cattle settle into calm. Her voice broke the silence, low but certain. "You're not afraid of me." He turned, his face lit by the fading light. "No, fear's for those who can't see truth. I see you." The words lodged in her chest, breaking through the armor she had built around her soul. For years she had been a monster, a spectacle, a prisoner of iron and whispers. But in his eyes, she was something else. A woman, a partner, a life not yet finished. Her heart, once a cage of its own, began to loosen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine belonging, trust, maybe even love. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain across the wide earth, she whispered the word that sealed the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. The word left her lips like a stone breaking the surface of still water, sending ripples through both their lives. She had not spoken such a word in years, not in trust, not in hope, not in the trembling edge of surrender. Yet under the weight of his quiet resolve, the word felt less like surrender and more like discovery. From that moment, their lives wove together, not with sudden passion, but with the steady rhythm of the land. Dawn found them side by side, he with the tools of his trade, she with strength that turned labor into progress. The fences grew strong, the barns stood tall, the herds flourished. At night, when the sky scattered its endless stars across the plains, they sat by the fire, silence no longer a burden but a shared comfort. Still, the town did not forget. Whispers followed them when they rode in for supplies. Eyes watched her, some narrowed in suspicion, others wide with a fear that never softened. The old story of her dead husband clung like a burr that could not be plucked away. No one asked her side. No one wanted to know. She had lived too long beneath the weight of their judgment to offer explanation. Yet one night, under a swollen moon, she spoke the truth at last. He had asked her for nothing. No answers, no confessions, but the words pressed against her chest until silence was no longer possible. "My husband," she said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the fire, was not the man the town remembers. He drank himself into rages. His fists were heavier than words, and his cruelty knew no end. That night, he came for me again, but he misjudged the strength he always feared. I pushed him back. He fell. His neck broke against the hearthstone. She waited for recoil, for disappointment, for the same suspicion the town cast upon her. But the rancher's face did not change. He stared into the flames, as though the truth was not a shock but the missing piece of a puzzle he had already understood. "You defended yourself," he said simply. The breath she had held spilled out in a shudder. "They called it murder. They put me in chains." His eyes turned to her then, steady, unwavering. "You survived. That's not murder. That's life fighting to stay alive." For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the weight shift. The word widow had long been her cage, twisted into a curse by those who had never known her suffering. But here was a man who stripped the word of its poison, who saw her not as a monster or victim, but as a woman who had endured. The seasons turned. The ranch flourished. Together, they became something neither had been alone, a force, steady and unbroken. The townsfolk, though still wary, could not deny what they saw. Crops grew where none had before. Cattle multiplied, strong and well kept. And always, the giant widow worked with a strength that made the impossible ordinary. But fate does not leave such stories untouched. One autumn, as the harvest waned and the first frost edged the fields, trouble rode in. Men with restless eyes and quick hands came to the town, outlaws who fed on fear. They heard of the rancher with the giant wife, of the wealth in cattle and land. And they decided such fortune was theirs to claim. They came at dusk, 5 of them, rifles gleaming under the fading light. They rode hard into the yard, shouting threats, demanding cattle, demanding coin. The rancher stepped out first, calm as always, his hand steady on his holster. She followed, her towering frame casting a shadow across the dirt. The outlaws laughed at the sight of her, mocking, spitting words meant to cut. But their laughter faltered when they saw she did not tremble, did not hide. She stood like a wall of flesh and bone, unshakable. The leader sneered, "You think that giant of yours scares us? A woman's a woman, no matter the size. Step aside, or we'll put you both in the ground." The rancher's hand hovered near his pistol, but before he could move, she stepped forward. Her voice, low and steady, rolled like thunder across the yard. "You'll take nothing from here." They fired a warning shot into the air, but she did not flinch. One man dismounted, eager to prove his bravado. He swung the butt of his rifle at her head. With a movement swift as a striking bear, she caught the weapon mid-swing. The wood cracked in her grip, splintering like kindling. The outlaw staggered back, eyes wide. Before he could draw again, the rancher's pistol barked once, the bullet shattering the man's hand. The yard erupted into chaos. Gunfire tore through the dusk. She moved with a fury none of them had expected, seizing one man by the collar and hurling him into the side of the barn. Another aimed at her chest, but the rancher's shot dropped him before the trigger could be pulled. When the dust cleared, 2 men lay dead, the others scrambling for their horses, fleeing into the night with curses trailing behind them. Silence fell heavy. She stood, chest heaving, her hands marked by splinters and blood. He holstered his pistol, his eyes never leaving her. And then, slowly, he stepped to her side. "You saved us," he said. Her breath trembled. For years she had been condemned for a death she never sought. For years she had been called killer, monster, curse. But here she stood not as a widow in a cage, but as a woman who had defended her home, her husband, her life. The town came days later, drawn by the sound of gunfire and rumors that spread faster than truth. They found the ranch standing, the outlaws gone, the couple unbroken. Whispers rose again, but this time they were different. They spoke not of a monster, but of a woman who had stood unshaken against men with rifles. Time does not erase fear easily, but respect began to take root where suspicion once lived. The townsfolk no longer turned their faces away when she walked past. Children, once frightened, now watched her with awe, and though whispers remained, they were softer, edged with something almost like reverence. Years passed. The ranch grew into a place of strength, not because of him alone, not because of her alone, but because together they had built something no storm, no rumor, no outlaw could take away. On a quiet evening, beneath a sky burning with the colors of sunset, he took her hand, large and calloused in his, and spoke words she had never thought to hear. "I don't need the town's blessing. I don't need their understanding. All I need is this, us. You've given me more than I ever dreamed. You've given me a life." Her eyes, once hardened into stone, softened with a warmth she had thought forever lost. "And you gave me freedom. You gave me a name that means more than curse. You gave me a place where I belong." They stood together as the last light dipped below the horizon, their shadows stretching long across the land they had made their own. She was no longer the giant widow in the cage. She was his wife, his strength, his equal. And in that truth, she found what chains, whispers, and even time had tried to steal: her life, her love, her place beneath the endless sky.